Welcome to Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters, where we talk about historical drama series and films as windows to the past and mirrors of the present. I'm Michonne Boston.
And I'm Tequina Boston. This is Revolution to Rights America at 250, a 10-episode podcast series from Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters. Revolution to Rights takes you on a journey through America's 250-year history of advancing freedom and justice since the Declaration of Independence in 1776.
The historical dramas featured in Revolution to Rights tell stories of battles fought in the quest for freedom and the people whose collective actions and courage inspire us to move beyond remembrance and to take actions today to ensure freedom and justice for all.
In this podcast, we revisit the 1970s through the 2020 FX series Mrs. America, currently streaming on Hulu. It's a time when the American women's movement and feminism gained political momentum and success with states, Congress, and the White House around the Equal Rights Amendment, or ERA, to prevent discrimination on the basis of sex. The feminists in the movement seem unstoppable until an ambitious and politically savvy conservative woman from Illinois launches a nationwide campaign from her home to crush the ERA.
As the feminist movement is changing the nation around equal rights for women, so is the activism of its dedicated opposition, who build a platform for political, social, and religious conservatism that continues to feed the political discourse and its divisions today. We explore the history of the Equal Rights Amendment and the key people fighting for its ratification and demise with Marjorie J. Spruill. Marjorie's 2017 book, Divided We Stand, The Battle Over Women's Rights and Family Values That Polarized American Politics, was a key resource for the stories in Mrs. America. Because there's so much to cover about the history of the Equal Rights Amendment and the women's movement, we've made this a two-part Revolution to Rights America at 250 podcast. In Part 1, Marjorie J. Spruill gives an overview of the history of the Equal Rights Amendment, why men and women in both major political parties supported the ERA, the origins of the word feminist, and how a changing world shaped the modern women's movement.
In Part 2 of our conversation around the Mrs. America series and the Equal Rights Amendment, Marjorie talks about the rise of Phyllis Schlafly and her campaign that grew by reaching out to religious conservatives. Marjorie also talks about the feminists who championed ERA and equal rights for women: Gloria Steinem, Bella Abzug, Shirley Chisholm, Betty Friedan, Jill Ruckelshaus, Brenda Feigen-Fastow, and many others. Marjorie talks about the success of the 1977 National Women's Conference in Houston and why the conference became a pivotal moment for both pro- and anti-ERA groups. Finally, Marjorie answers our question about the current status of the Equal Rights Amendment. That's all in Part 2. Featured in the Mrs. America miniseries as the real-life figures from the ERA battle are Cate Blanchett as Phyllis Schlafly, Rose Byrne as Gloria Steinem, Uzo Aduba as Shirley Chisholm, Margot Martindale as Bella Abzug, Elizabeth Banks as Jill Ruckelshaus, Tracy Ullman as Betty Friedan, Ari Grainer as Brenda Feigen-Fastow, Melanie Linsky as Rosemary Thompson, and Cindy Drummond as Lottie Beth Hobbs.
Our guest, Marjorie J. Spruill, is Emeritus Professor at the University of South Carolina. She specializes in United States history, particularly women's and gender history, and the history of the American South. In addition to Divided We Stand, Marjorie is the author of New Women of the New South, the leaders of the women's suffrage movement in the Southern states, the editor of One Woman, One Vote, Rediscovering the Women's Suffrage Movement, and Votes for Women, the women's suffrage movement in Tennessee, the South, and the nation. Marjorie J. Spruill has served as a member of the Executive Committee of the Southern Historical Association and president of the Southern Association for Women Historians. She has served on the editorial board of the Journal of Southern History and is currently on the editorial board of the Journal of American Studies, the Journal of the British Association for American Studies. She was a fellow at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard University and a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. Marjorie had a fellowship from the National Endowment for the Humanities and was a resident associate at the National Humanities Center. Her work has also been supported by the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation. Welcome, Marjorie, to Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters.
Very nice to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
We're going to start off with ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment, which says in its current form, equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. The text of the Equal Rights Amendment has gone through several iterations since it was first introduced in 1923 by Alice Paul, who was one of the leaders in the ratification of the 19th Amendment, giving women the vote. And you've written extensively about that as well. What are the essential meanings and purpose of the Equal Rights Amendment as it is now?
It is basically to prevent discrimination against women on the basis, of their sex. It is to make any law that is passed that would be discriminatory subject to strict scrutiny by the courts, and to sort of raise sex to the level of race and religion in terms of the things that cannot be ruled constitutional and legal by courts unless there's some really, really compelling reason for it. And that's basically it.
And one thing I find interesting, it doesn't say women, it just says on account of sex.
Yes, and that I was explaining what the reason behind it was, but you're right that it's meant to get rid of any kind of discrimination against anybody on the basis of sex. I remember that some of the cases that Ruth Bader Ginsburg argued before the Supreme Court that were so important. She would have male defendants and show that they were being discriminated on the basis of sex. And she was trying to make a point that this sex discrimination can have a negative impact on anybody.
Well, one of the things that's really interesting, because we're talking about the series Mrs. America, and in that series there is the term feminism is pretty prominent, and it feels like in these decades since that term was at first kind of lifted up as popular, that it's been battered about for a while by the culture wars, and to the point where there are even people who are advocates for women's rights and advocates for ERA who kind of distance themselves from the term. But where did the term feminist come from, and how has its definition or our understanding of its definition changed over time?
Interestingly, it started, I think that the word feminism was coined in mid-19th century in France. It came from a French utopian named Charles Fourier, who was admired, abroad as well. French feminists started to use the term later in the 19th century, and then it began to be translated into English as feminism and feminist, and used more by people in English-speaking countries in Britain and the U.S. It wasn't something that was widely used as part of the suffrage movement. It was maybe a few sort of out there cutting-edge individuals probably more of the ones that were attracted to the National Women's Party, led by Alice Paul, than the others. But it really wasn't a thing as part of the first wave, and it was embraced more as part of the more modern women's movement in this country. And I know by the time I was in college and at UNC in the late 60s, early 70s, that we were all using it and calling ourselves that. And it was that was sort of a heyday of the modern women's movement. Feminism was really cool, and people were feeling very proud to embrace the term um, and to support the cause. And so it was considered to be very positive then. But as part of the campaign against the Equal Rights Amendment, um, Phyllis Schlafly and other leaders of the conservative women's movement um, turned it all around, turned it on its head, and they took sort of what they would believe was about the most negative connotations associated with the women's rights movement and negative portrayals of women's rights advocates, and they managed to associate the word feminism with these negative traits in such a way that it had a really powerful effect. And so, as you say, even a lot of people who agreed with the ideas behind the movement were very hesitant to embrace the term. And they were wildly successful in making this a negative term all through the 80s and 90s, and it really wasn't until the 2000s on it that it started to really change to the point that it's back again as a hot term, and they and some of the the most popular, coolest, most famous young Americans from Beyonce to Emma Watson and others, were not, let alone first ladies from Laura Bush to Michelle Obama, never mentioned President Obama himself, who calls himself a feminist. Um, it's things have really changed. Now, obviously, as we'll be talking about over the course of this interview, it's a very polarized society. So I'm not saying everybody thinks it's a great word, but it's surprisingly, it's embraced a surprisingly large range of people who have different, who don't all share the same politics, but who now see themselves as advocates of women's rights.
That's fascinating because I think we could have a whole conversation about words or terms that were started out as positive, that the enemies of those movements changed them into negatives, but we won't go there today.
Or that the word originated from someone named Charles. Isn't that a
Yeah.
man's
That's
name?
interesting.
Or
He was
was this like
he
George
he
Eliot? I
believed,
mean, I don't know.
as part of his philosophy, he believed that all social progress was dependent upon the advancement of women in society. So there's, the women's movement has always had a lot of support from progressive men.
Right.
Uh, not all of them, not all of them, but that men have played an important role in both advancing the rights of women and suppressing the rights of women. Um, I used to say on the very first day of my women's history classes that I've taught over half of a century that I would always have some men in the class, and I would say, "This is the one time I'm going to single you out. And that's it for the semester, but I just want to say that you're welcome in this class and that I am not going to present women's history as a them against us proposition because
Mhm.
it was not the way it played out. There were always some men and some women for and against the equal rights for women.
Now, you had mentioned about the first wave of feminism, and we've heard the term second wave of feminism. What
Mhm.
do those terms mean? What are they signaling to us about feminism and its evolution and its role in the women's rights movement overall?
It's symbolizing that there have been concentrated periods of time in which the movement was especially active, vocal, visible, and contested, um, large numbers of supporters, and getting a lot of attention throughout the country. Um, Now, what is often called now the first wave is we usually are thinking of the women's suffrage movement, but we actually began it in the 1820s and 30s when women first started to speak out on women's rights, and it was not focused as much on suffrage. And after the Civil War, though, it began to be focused more on suffrage. And then around the 1890s, as our nation was getting more and more conservative, and uh, they began. Susan B. Anthony actually began a strategy of let's focus more and more on getting the vote and try not to take on so many issues so that we can maximize our power by making it a single issue campaign. And that way, people who may not agree on lots of other issues, but who believe that women should have the vote can join us. So that was a key part of it. So the second wave is largely associated thus with the suffrage movement, though at all times, women who were working for suffrage were also concerned about other things. People have criticized the term, the whole wave imagery and the second wave in particular, because it focuses on the 60s and 70s especially, and thus neglects the fact that their women were continuing to work for women's rights through the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, and it kind of minimizes their contributions to say that, "Oh, it all starts again in the '60s." Um, so that's a legitimate criticism, and we should never, forget that what women and their supporters were doing in those interim decades. But there's no question that the movement started to catch on again and take hold and have some successes, in that period of the '60s and '70s.
I mean, I will take a risk here by saying as more and more households had televisions in the United States, that any movements that were happening were now being witnessed in sort of real time, at
Mhm,
least film at
mhm.
11 at the
Yeah,
most. And I think
helps
that
spread the word and yeah.
yeah, I think that sort of creates those what would I say? People place that as the marker that something's happening versus the 19th century where, it's the written word
Mhm.
and, maybe some engravings at the most.
Well, I think
Um
in all ages, different technologies enable information to spread. So, in some earlier conversations, we've talked about the role of people who carried information via shipping. And
Mm,
of course, we know the printing press revolutionized communication and, of course, radio and television. And now, social media, people actually do document and present news in real time. So
yes,
it has all has a role in increasing awareness.
that's
Yeah.
right, and with social media, particularly everyone having video cameras in their pocket, it has a historic role as well. There are a lot of things are captured on film that would have happened and would have been denied that, and now we can't do that as easily.
well, speaking of the printed word, and the written record. Your book is called Divided We Stand. It's a great book.
Thank
Tell us the significance of the title at the time you were writing it, because we know we talk about divisions today, and that's even front page news. So talk about the title, the focus of the book, which served as a source material for the series Mrs. America. What motivated you to write Divided We Stand about the events and people surrounding? And I think the big moment is the National Women's Convention in 1977.
77. Mhm.
Yeah, but you also go into the '80s and up
Yeah.
until the 2016 election and Hillary Clinton's, run for the presidency.
Mhm. Um, the title, originally, I was just going to call it something like The Battle Over Women's Rights and Family Values, that as it began to sink in with me, that I was not just telling a story about the women's rights movement and a really important convention that they held that was a part of it, but that I was telling a story essentially of two women's movements. One, the women's rights movement that, you know, rekindled in the 60s and was massively successful in the early 70s. And then another women's movement that started in opposition to it and then grew, and then how the two movements fought with each other all through the 70s, sort of culminating in this national convention and the protest convention held at the same time. And then how you ended up having Americans polarized over women's and gender issues to the point that in 1980, the two political parties essentially chose up sides between them and sort of hardened their platforms in positions that they still hold today. And so I began to realize, wait a minute, what you're telling is a story about the nation and how we got to be the highly polarized and bitterly partisan culture that we now occupy. And so that title, Divided We Stand, s- popped into my mind because it means a lot. It kind of meant that as women stood up in the 1970s, they were divided. And then the result of those divisions divided the nation, and that we remain divided. We still stand divided. And so that's what it meant to me, that it was the story of two women's movements and the growing political activity of women through the 70s, to the point that by 1980, they were voting in larger percentages than men, which had not been the case before, and that they would remain politically active, and we still outvote men, and we are still very divided in terms of how we use our political power.
You've been enjoying Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters, a podcast where we talk about historical drama films and series as windows to the past and mirrors of the present.
Make sure you subscribe to our podcast on your favorite platform. Share the excitement with your friends. Visit MichonneBostonGroup.com/Boston Sisters. Join the historical drama community by signing up for our e-newsletter so you'll never miss an update, future episodes, or exclusive bonus content.
Now, back to our fascinating conversation.
In the early days of the ERA, which is reflected in this series and, of course, your book, it had the support of GOP women, which is
Yes.
Fascinating history. But then, of course, Republicans were also anti-slavery at one time during
Yeah.
the Lincoln years and before.
Mhm.
Um, so ERA had the support of women in the GOP and the Democratic Party. Where was the common ground, and where did parties' interests and motivations diverge?
Mhm. Well, I'm really gonna shock you then and tell you that when the ERA was first introduced by Alice Paul in 1923, guess which party was for it and which party was against it?
I have a feeling it was the Republicans were for it and the Democrats were against it,
Yes.
particularly since there were so many southern states that were late to even pass the 19th Amendment.
Well, the reason for this had to do with labor laws
Ah.
because, in the progressive era, which the suffrage movement was part of, um, the advocates for workers had not been able to get the government or the courts to grant any kind of protective occupational safety, equal pay, or anything like that for workers, period, for men or women. But progressives began to push for the idea that, okay, for women who are the mothers of future Americans, their health and safety ought to be a legitimate concern of the state, and therefore laws that protected them ought to be constitutional. And that very argument was argued in a case called Muller versus Oregon, 1908, before the Supreme Court. And so, in other words, women's biological difference from men was considered was and the idea that they would be mothers of future Americans was something that made the court say, okay, protective legislation for women is okay. And it was immediately hotly contested because business interest did not want that. They had shut that out for men. They didn't want that for any workers because, and they argued in the old laissez-faire argument that businesses prefer that, the government is interfering in the relationship between a worker and their employer. And so when Alice Paul and the National Woman's Party in 1923 came out with this that said essentially that governments can't make any laws that separately affect one sex or the other, um, the labor unions were outraged because they had just won, this big victory, and were still fighting against those who were trying already to strike it down. And the suffrage, and so they were opposed, and the Democrats even then were associated with them. But here's the amazing thing is the vast majority of suffragists, those who were part of the National American Woman Suffrage Association, um, they too were the ones who had been fighting so hard to get protective legislation for women. And so they were at odds with Alice Paul and the National Woman's Party already because they were picketing the White House and insulting the president uh, and challenging him even in the midst of a war, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of things that in later years we've admired these women for having the courage to do, but at the time, this was also while the National American Woman Suffrage Association was trying to get those last votes that they needed, and they thought that this was really hurting the movement.
And
And
the president was,
Wilson,
Woodrow Wilson.
yes, and he was outraged by the activities of these women that were protesting him and calling him Kaiser Wilson and everything. And he was one of the key people that the other suffragists were trying, to persuade as nicely as they could, you need to do this. So there were huge tensions between the National American Woman Suffrage Association and the National Woman's Party already. And so after the suffrage victory in 1920, when Alice Paul and the National Women's Party put forward the Equal Rights Amendment, which would have been, if passed, they believed, struck down having separate laws for men and women. So they were like, how dare you? We've got, how could you even consider doing this? This would hurt women. And so it became a big battle between them, huge battle that went through the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, in which, large numbers of women who were progressives, who wanted to do things to help poorer women who were often found in sex-segregated jobs where they were being exploited. And they would say to the National Women's Party people, you're saying that you're acting as if all women who work are in the kinds of jobs that men are also in, and that you think that doing away with any kind of protective legislation that's really not something you're concerned about. You want women to have equal rights to be lawyers and doctors and et cetera. But so these are the kinds of things that were going on. Meanwhile, the Republican Party, which hated the protective legislation, thought this is great. If the ERA passes, the protective legislation will be gone, and we'll be all set. We can keep on exploiting women workers, or we can do what we want. But at any rate, they were very supportive, and it went into the party platform, and lots of over the years, even Eisenhower really supported it, and so by 1970, so the late 60s, when the National Organization for Women was founded, and then it decided to take up this thing that had been a leftover from the suffrage years or whatever, the Equal Rights Amendment. That was something that the labor unions, the women who were at the meeting, who were part of the labor movement, which had led a fight for equal rights for years, but wanted to have protective legislation, they had to get up and walk out. Mm. And meanwhile, at that same meeting, Alice Paul, now elderly, and some of her associates who had been pushing the ERA for half a century, they were thrilled that these younger women now were, in this new era, were embracing their cause. And so what happened is that the women who were involved in labor unions had a bit of a job to do to convince their unions that things had changed, and that in the 40s and 60s, that there had been new laws passed that protected workers across the board. And so it was now safe to have this Equal Rights Amendment because there was protective legislation for men and women, that it was a different era, and so it would be okay. And so then Labor changed its position, and the Democrats changed their position. And so by 1970, you have this amazing period in which both parties are on the same page. It still took a couple of years before it got through both houses of Congress, but in 1972, when it got through, it was overwhelming. Sam Ervin of North Carolina, who opposed it, could only persuade 7 other senators to oppose it. And it was just amazing. So this vast bipartisan support from Teddy Kennedy on one side to Strom Thurmond on the other. Strom Thurmond said, I want my daughter to be able to have the same rights as my son. So what I'm trying to say is, it wasn't that the Republicans suddenly changed their position. It was that the Democrats had changed their position. The Republicans still had their old position, and both sides are seeing this nascent women's rights movement that is suddenly becoming vocal and vast, appealing to all types, of women. The 50th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, they're marching down Fifth Avenue, 10, 12 people abreast for miles, and then all over the rest of the country and in a few other countries, they're marching to celebrate this joyous, surging movement. And so politicians on both sides of the aisle are thinking, man, I got to get behind this. So you have both parties on the same page, and conservative women have not yet organized. And so that was the reason. Both parties are making concessions to the women's movement. All three branches of the federal government were making changes that were supportive of women's equality. And the Equal Rights Amendment gets through with very little opposition.
Wow, that was a special, I can't call it moment because I know that there was a lot of work that went behind it, a lot of, advocacy, et cetera, but it's almost sounds like ancient history compared to what we're seeing now.
Fortunately, it was a moment much different from our own era,
Yeah.
in which, the public opinion polls are showing, huge support for women's equality, and politicians felt obliged to support it whether they wanted to or not,
Yeah.
including the likes of Richard Nixon, that Bella Abzug considered to be America's number one chauvinist pig. But
I
his
remember that
daughters were
term.
for it. His wife, was just after him to appoint women to the Supreme Court. And he felt that and his party had been supporting it for all these years. So he did support the Equal Rights Amendment, at least in words. And he did a lot of other things to try to support the movement, including having Jill Ruckelshaus, who becomes a very important figure and a leading Republican feminist, to be in part of his staff advocating for women's rights. He recruited from the New York financial district this woman named Patricia Franklin, brilliant young woman, to come join his staff for the particular purpose of recruiting talented women to hold high-level positions in the federal government. It is a different era.
Yes, for
And
sure.
a lot of women ended up, who became important in later administrations, began their careers in politics and government as a result of joining during the time that Pat Franklin was recruiting. And I saw her on television recently talking about those days.
Yeah.
So it was quite an interesting moment in our history.
I'll say. As I was watching, Mrs. America, what came, through for me, and maybe this was the way that it was being dramatized, but I was hearing, the women who were involved with the National Organization for Women who were pro-ERA and pro-advancing women's rights, talking about women's rights.
Mhm.
And then, I was hearing the, uh, women who were what you would call the conservative movement and who were opposing ERA. And Phyllis Schlafly was, of course, the leading voice and organizer in that, talking about protecting privileges.
Yes.
Could you talk about how are rights different from privileges?
Privileges, I think, are something that other people give you, and rights are something that from our forefathers on down, it's the idea that there's something you just have, you know. Sometimes you have to fight to get them recognized or to gain them, but, the idea is it's rightfully yours. Um, but, both of these are words that have been used in all kinds of different ways. But as you so correctly say, Schlafly was trying to point to a distinction, and she was saying that women already were in a privileged position, that over centuries it had taken women a long time to get men to come around to the point that they were protectors of women. She invoked all this chivalric language and said, we finally got them where we want them to be, and that is that they believe in, that they commit to marriage, and then the law requires them to support their wife and support their children. And this is, is a privilege of the American woman to be able to raise her own children and to be supported in that by her husband. And the feminists are throwing all that away. They're demanding that women have the same rights as men, and therefore they'll have to, they'll have to work for a living and no longer have the benefit of breadwinners, and they'll have to be like in that horrible Soviet Union where women are all in the workforce and the children go into government-sponsored childcare where they're indoctrinating them. And when there's wars, women will be drafted just like men, which that was an argument she made that really helped her cause. All for the price of what? Freedom to be like men? Who wants to be like men? What you're trying to do is create this sameness of the sexes, to declare that there are no differences and for the law not to recognize any differences. Next thing you know, there'll be same-sex bathrooms, and women will be in the foxholes. And women, do you want other women to be in the foxholes with your husbands? That's going to destroy the marriages and all of this. And so she said that in her Phyllis Schlafly report, which went out once a month, that women who were, let's say, high achieving professional women were trying to get these equal rights, that would actually, they were women who wanted to go into the workforce anyway, but as they challenged this protective legislation that had caused husbands to have to support their wives, that what this was going to mean is that all women were going to be forced into the workforce, and they were going to have to compete with men, for jobs, and that they were going to suffer as the result. She argued, you are trying to put down the whole idea of the traditional homemaker, and you want to put all kids in these childcare centers. And, in other words, she was holding up this vision of a society in which people couldn't live their lives the way that she did, um,
With her housekeeper.
with her housekeeper, with her rich lawyer husband. Um, she was absolutely uh, blind in her rhetoric and everything to the idea that uh, a lot of what she was talking about was class privilege.
Mhm.
Lots of women had always been working, and that even though it was still true at this time that the majority of married women uh, did not work outside the home, there were lots and lots of them who did. Now, one of the major points is that this is complicated, but you know, um, after World War II, there were social, political, technological, economic, demographic forces that were changing the society so that more and more women were um, in the workforce. And in fact, that gave rise, sort of created the underlying conditions for the rise of the women's rights movement. But Schlafly and the other conservative women who became part of her movement, they blamed the feminists for these changes, for demanding changes that were forcing women out of the home and into the workforce. So in reality, it was these impersonal economic forces that were driving women out of the or luring women, in whatever way you want to look at it, into the workforce. And the feminist movement is a response to that. You know,
Mhm, mhm.
when American businesses need more secretaries at a time that women were marrying earlier, having children earlier, and then after the GI Bill changed our society to the point that you had to have a college education for a middle-class job, then families like mine were, mothers were going to work, um, in order to help save enough money that the kids could go to college. Um, so you have all these women, uh, who are needing to have a job. So even if they've taken time off while their children were young, they're pouring back into the workforce.
Right, yeah,
Um,
yeah.
and then they're going taking secretarial jobs and having people call them girls.
Mm.
I'll get my girl to call your girl by men that are much younger than you, you know? It became a sore point, but some would say a trivial point, but it symbolized the fact that habits such as, having s young women working before they dropped out of the workforce after they got married was the old way, and they called them girls. Now you're having larger numbers of older married women pouring into the workforce, and once they're there, they're not getting ready to drop out right away. They want to be paid better and be able to move up the ladder to be promoted, and when they were still treated like people used to assume that women would work just a little while before they got married and then they'd leave the workforce, so therefore, you weren't looking to promote them. This is a whole different era now. Um, Women are living longer. They're living longer after they have had children.
Mm.
They're outliving men. They are increasingly, in other words, needing to have an income and to be self-supporting. And all of these things are creating a world in which you're still living with the laws and customs that were made for a different world. And in my view, that's what the modern women's movement was all about. It was trying to get the laws and customs of our society changed to reflect the way women were now living their lives.
Join us for part 2 of this Mrs. America conversation with Marjorie J. Spruill as we talk about the rise of Phyllis Schlafly and why the 1977 National Women's Conference is a pivotal moment for the feminist movement and ERA. What is the status of the Equal Rights Amendment today?
The FX series Mrs. America is streaming on Hulu with a subscription. Do a search to find other platforms to stream the 9-part series. Fees may apply. Marjorie J. Spruill's book Divided We Stand, The Battle Over Women's Rights and Family Values That Polarized American Politics, is available in our affiliate bookstore on the Revolution to Rights America at 250 bookshelf. Go to our website at michonnebostongroup.com/Boston Sisters to find the link to the affiliate bookstore. Find the webpage for this episode on our website to download this and other podcasts.
Subscribe to Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters on your favorite podcast platform. You'll be notified about future Revolution to Rights America at 250 and other podcasts, including our annual Page to Screen podcast where Michonne and I reveal our book list for summer reading, inspired by the 5th season of Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters.
Thank you for catching this episode of Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters. We hope you enjoyed our exploration of captivating historical films and series dramas. Find us on Instagram at Historical Drama Sisters and on Facebook at Historical Drama Boston Sisters.
We want to hear from you. What historical dramas are you watching? Share your favorites. We may feature them in a future episode. Don't forget to subscribe. Visit our website at michonnebostongroup.com/Boston Sisters and share the podcast with fellow historical drama enthusiasts.
Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters is brought to you by the Michonne Boston Group. The views and opinions expressed on Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters are those of the speakers and do not represent the positions or views of the Michonne Boston Group, its clients, or affiliates. This is Michonne Boston.
And this is Tequina Boston.
Thank you for listening.